My mother married me off to a wealthy second generation with disabled legs. On the day of our marriage, I cautiously asked him, "Do you want me to carry you to bed?" He casually laughed, saying, "No need." I rolled up my sleeves to carry him, but I lost my balance and we both fell to the ground. It was so close, I almost directly inherited billions in assets. After graduating from university, my mother sold me to a rich man for a dowry of millions. I heard that he was a standard rich end generation. He lost the inheritance rights of his family due to an accident that left him with crippled legs. Now, I had wealth and leisure. However, my mother was worried because she heard that he not only injured his legs, but also couldn't have a relationship. My eyes lit up. It was perfect, rich and respectable, a husband who can't have a relationship. What could be more blissful? So, my mother and I divided the dowry and joyfully married into this life. Why did I marry a cripple? Because of money. Such a vulgar and materialistic reason. On the day of the wedding, I was still a bit nervous. He needed a wife without a background to be a decorative vase, and my mother and I were greedy, so it was a perfect match. In fact, we only met for the first time on the day of the wedding. Before the ceremony, my mother pushed me into his resting room under the pretense of building emotional connection. It was only 10 minutes before the entrance. Was there time for this supposed emotional connection? As I walked in with my wedding dress, trying to figure out how to greet him, I suddenly froze. Didn't you say he was a poor little man with crippled legs who can't have a relationship? Who is this man sitting on the wheelchair, dressed in a well-tailored black suit? Although it was a wedding, he had casually undone 2 buttons of his shirt. Even sitting in a wheelchair, his posture was straight, dignified, and aloof. My gaze moved up. It was a stunning face. No words could describe his beauty. With a slip, I tripped over the wedding dress and awkwardly ended up half kneeling in front of him. I looked up at him, stuttering. I said I walked into the wrong room. Do you believe me? After I entered, he had already looked me over. At that moment, he was sitting in a wheelchair while I knelt awkwardly, and his gaze finally settled on the wedding dress that was sent by him. Can you guess? I guess he might be crippled, but not stupid. To ease the awkwardness, I quickly stood up. I had to speak the truth. My mother asked me to come and build a connection with you. The man chuckled softly. He glanced at his watch. 5 minutes of connection should be enough for the wedding. Remembering that this man was my benefactor, I quickly asked, "Is there anything I should pay attention to during the wedding?" In my mind, I was screaming wildly, "Give me demands. Set conditions. And add more money." However, he glanced at me and nonchalantly loosened his tie. "No need, just quietly be a decorative vase." I tactfully agreed, standing silently on the side without speaking, but my gaze kept uncontrollably darting towards him. I felt shallow and guilty. I regretted my previous insensitive joy over his condition. Such a remarkable face, it was a waste that the wedding ended successfully. Being a decorative vase was simple. I just needed to stand tall, smile under the spotlight, and endure until the ceremony was over. Philip seemed pleased with my performance. After the wedding, slightly tipsy, he stuffed a bank card into my arms. He didn't mention the purpose or amount. But judging by his demeanor, it was likely a reward. Lord Smith wouldn't be stingy. I kept the card safe and only later thought to ask for the PIN. Besides the bank card, he also threw me a set of keys and a piece of paper with an address and phone number. He left in a private car, letting me find my own way home. I didn't have the heart to go to Mr. Smith's villa. So, I went to a nearby bank first thing with the bank card. But to my excitement, when I checked the balance at the ATM, my hands shook. However, the balance displayed on the screen was just $100. Just 100, not a million. I stared at the screen for a while, until the person behind me impatiently said, "You have been hesitating over $100. Do you want me to light incense before you withdraw it?" I blushed and withdrew the card, feeling disappointed. I might not have had much emotion, but I still wore a heavy wedding gown to marry him. $100, was he playing a joke on me? The more I thought about it, the more annoyed I became. I withdrew the 100, used his money to hire 3 taxis. I rode in one, while the other 2 empty taxis followed. But I made a mistake. Mr. Smith's mansion was much farther away than I anticipated, and the 3 taxis cost me over $400. I spent $100 and the extra $300. It was just my luck. It was the wedding night. I sat on the sofa, staring at Philip's handsome face, feeling nothing but anger. As I was internally criticizing him, Philip suddenly looked at me. Sophia, Philip's gaze met mine, light and airy, yet somehow piercing. When our eyes met, he bit his lip lightly and softly said, "It's time to sleep." My face involuntarily reddened a bit. But reminding myself of my mother's words, I was doused with cold water. Do you need me to carry you to bed?" I asked cautiously. "I'm really strong." Philip sat in the wheelchair, casually loosening 2 buttons, laughing casually. "Thanks." I walked over and crouched in front of Philip with my back facing him. After a brief pause, I licked my lips and added, "I'm really strong." Philip sat in the wheelchair and tilted his body slightly forward, placing his hands lightly on my shoulders. His arms were also long and slender, draped casually across my neck, emitting a fresh scent similar to pine. My intention was simple, just a gesture to the benefactor, but having him so close with this physical contact made my face instantly flush. He had taken off his suit jacket, leaving only a white shirt on him while I had changed out of my wedding dress into a thin Toastmasters outfit. The moment I carried him, I could feel Philip's body warmth. This realization made me a bit nervous. My feet shuffled, and I accidentally stepped on the dragging hem of my skirt, causing me to fall while carrying Philip. I ended up on the ground, afraid to get up. I assure you, I'm not usually a comical woman, and for the first 20-something years of my life, I considered myself smart. I don't know what came over me today. I not only fell, but also brought the benefactor down with me. For a long moment, I didn't hear any sounds from Philip. Suddenly, I started to panic. Had he fainted from the fall? Just as I thought of lifting my head to check, I heard his voice from in front of me. Soft, low. "Come here." I got up, cautiously walked over, and knelt down. I tried to explain, but before I could gather my words, he suddenly grabbed my wrist tightly, and in one swift motion, I fell into his arms. The floor was cold. Philip lay on the ground, one hand gripping mine tightly, and his eyes surveying me as I lay across his body. From this close proximity, the man looked incredibly handsome. "Sophia," he said, gazing at me somewhat sternly, "let's go to the wheelchair. I can manage getting on the bed myself." Philip's gaze was a bit invasive, and I dared not meet his eyes, avoiding his gaze as I helped him up. But thinking about his disabled legs that prevented him from standing, I placed him back on the floor after helping him onto the wheelchair. "Please sit for a moment, I'll push the wheelchair," I said. Philip remained silent, his eyes a bit dimmed. I guessed that he might be regretting it and thinking that he should have bought a smarter decorative vase. To make amends, I hurried to push the wheelchair back. When I went to assist him, Philip stayed still, almost as if he was being stubborn. "What's the matter? Still mad?" I looked down at him, and he sighed, faintly saying, "You're hurting my foot." I apologized, and to make amends, I exerted all my strength, bent over, and carried him back to the wheelchair. But it seemed Mr. Smith wasn't entirely satisfied. He pressed his lips tightly, his ears turning red, and spoke through gritted teeth. "Sophia, I asked you to assist, not carry me." "Sorry," I responded, nudging the wheelchair towards the bed, wondering how he would get on it. However, I heard his slightly irritated voice from behind me. "Why are you still standing there?" I quickly turned around. Philip was sitting on the ground, looking a bit weak in his legs, biting his lip and red in the ear. Perhaps, the consecutive falls had wounded Mr. Smith's self-esteem. For leverage, I propped his arm on my shoulder, helping him up while comforting him. "Mr. Fu, don't take it to heart. If I were disabled, I wouldn't even be able to wipe my own butt, let alone go to the bathroom." Mid-sentence, Philip's hand on my shoulder tightened. "Shut up." "Fine." And so, I helped Philip onto the bed and received his command. "From now on, whenever we go out together, just smile and don't speak. He pays, I work. If he doesn't want me to talk, I could probably drink water through my nose." On our wedding night, I was going to sleep on the floor. But Philip wouldn't allow it. He asked me to sleep next to him, sharing a blanket. I was willing, but still shy. As I blushed and hesitated, he suddenly handed me a bank card. After a brief pause, I asked, "Another 100? 200,000, he replied. "Deal, husband." I happily accepted the card with a big smile. The night was peaceful but a bit chilly. That damn guy rolled up the blanket in the middle of the night, leaving me cold. I had to move closer to him to share the warmth, struggling with just half of the blanket. Vaguely remembering, his body felt unusually warm, like he was a furnace. The next morning, Philip was already sitting in his wheelchair when I woke up. I don't know how he managed to get there. The wheelchair was by the bed, and Philip was engrossed in reading a book. The warm sunlight outside gilded his features. He looked handsome. I was lost in my thoughts when Philip suddenly glanced over. "Let's go downstairs and have breakfast," I responded, and noticed a hint of darkness in Philip's eyes. Had he not slept well last night? He was sound asleep, clutching the blanket. Philip put the book down, wheeled his chair out of the room, and I quickly got up to freshen up. In passing, I glanced at the book Philip had been reading, and I was surprised at how whimsical the noble young men could be. After breakfast, Philip left the house. Before leaving, he instructed me to be dressed and ready by 7 p.m., waiting at home for him. We were invited to the Smiths family banquet that evening. I obediently agreed. Attending the Smiths family banquet was a big deal. However, Philip didn't seem concerned, even though there were many notable guests at our wedding yesterday, and none of the Smiths attended. But Philip seemed unfazed. He didn't need me to work, and staying alone in this empty mansion was boring. So, I flagged down a taxi to go out and explore. There were dusty luxury cars in Philip's garage, but he didn't provide me with a driver, and I didn't have a driver's license. With the bank card in hand, I went to the city's most upscale mall. The mall was crowded with people, mostly window shopping. As the items were too expensive for ordinary folks. After wandering around with empty hands, my stomach started to ache. Remembering I had tissues in my bag, I turned towards the public restroom. However, due to the weekend rush, the women's restroom had a long line, while the men's side was empty. Unable to bear the stomach ache, I quietly sneaked into the men's restroom. Closing the door, I was about to pull up my pants when the partition wall was knocked twice. A deep, magnetic voice came from the next stall. "Excuse me, could you spare me some paper?" The voice was so captivating, I quickly retrieved the remaining tissues from my bag and handed them over. But a few seconds later, the tissues were pushed back to me. "Do you have something else? Is this not appropriate?" I was confused and took a peek. What was returned to me from the other stall was a sanitary pad from my bag. Blushing, I quickly swapped it with tissues, saying, "Sorry, I picked the wrong item." After a few seconds, the person finally took it. His tone sounded slightly amused. "Are you a girl?" It dawned on me that I was in the men's restroom. Feeling embarrassed, I hurriedly left. At 7 p.m., when Philip returned home, I had changed into a formal dress and sat elegantly on the sofa. As soon as his wheelchair-bound figure appeared, I approached him, twirling my skirt, seeking approval. Do I look good? Although I sometimes got lost in my thoughts and said the wrong things, I hadn't made any major fashion blunders. From high-end parties to club nights, my outfits rarely missed the mark. Philip's gaze lingered on me for 6 to 7 seconds, then casually averted his eyes, saying, "It's okay." His avoidance suggested he was too hesitant to look at me. As his financial supporter, I didn't want to embarrass him. So, I volunteered to be Philip's assistant, pushing his wheelchair out. We arrived at the Smiths mansion, a vast estate stretching beyond sight. All eyes were on us as we entered, but I smiled confidently and pushed Philip through the audience. Approaching the main hall, we saw a couple standing there, the man in a well-tailored suit, and the woman in a red dress exuding grace. As we drew nearer, Philip paused for a moment and called out, "Brother." It was confirmed that the man was Samuel, the heir of the Smiths. Acknowledging Philip with a nod, Samuel's gaze shifted from Philip to me. His eyes were sharp, leaving me intimidated. Suppressing my surprise, I followed Philip's lead and addressed him as brother. However, upon hearing my voice, Samuel raised an eyebrow, a hint of astonishment in his calm gaze. In the next moment, his eyes left my face and landed on my wrist. Turning to look, I noticed I was wearing a silver bracelet that blended well with my attire. Without thinking much, I didn't remove it. Perplexed, I raised my head, only to find Samuel had looked away. His earlier scrutiny seemed like my imagination. His commanding aura was strong, yet he didn't linger too long and moved on to converse with Philip. Seemingly uninterested in socializing, Philip had me push him to a secluded corner, where he remained quietly in his wheelchair, scanning the room without a word. Feeling restless eventually, I suggested we take a trip to the restroom. Philip nodded in agreement. While wandering in the corridor, noticing it was empty, I retrieved a cigarette from my purse, claiming it was a restroom break, but driven by a smoking urge. Just as I lit the cigarette, footsteps approached from behind. Panicked, I tried to put out the cigarette as a familiar voice came from the shadows, "Don't bother." Can I have one? Keeping my hand behind me with the cigarette, I turned to see Samuel. Standing a few steps away, he extended his palm, signaling for a cigarette. Hesitating for a moment, I reluctantly handed him one, wary of its strength. Unperturbed, Samuel's lips curled into a slight smile. Perfect timing. With no other choice, I opened my bag and gave him another cigarette. Lighting it, he exhaled smoke and turned to me. You didn't recognize me? Flustered, I awkwardly acknowledged him as Philip's brother. Shaking his head, Samuel took another drag and, looking at me, asked, No, I meant thanks for the tissue this afternoon. Was that you? Before I could process this, a figure in a wheelchair turned the corner. Philip wheeled himself closer, lazily gazing at me. Who is he? Speechless, I struggled to respond. Meanwhile, Samuel, with a cigarette between his fingers, remained calm and indifferent. Under Philip's scrutiny, he even took a drag of his cigarette. He clearly had no intention of answering Philip's question. Caught in a bind, how could I explain that I had roamed a high-end mall, snuck into a men's restroom, and passed a sanitary pad to his brother next stall? It made me feel utterly clueless. Hesitating, Philip's voice came again. Let's go. With that, he turned his wheelchair and left. I quickly followed, passing by Samuel, who suddenly spoke up. His voice was low. The smoke is not bad. After some inexplicable conversation, I dashed out and took the initiative to push Philip's wheelchair. I'm not stupid, I can tell who my benefactor is. Although Samuel is much richer than his brother. Perhaps due to the large number of Smiths, it was called a family banquet but felt more like an upscale wine party. I stood behind Philip, hands on the wheelchair, smiling as I looked at everyone passing by. However, despite the many people around, not a single person stopped to greet Philip. It seems Philip not only lost his position as the heir but also had a pitiful status within the family. Thinking this, I started to feel a bit sorry for him. But Philip seemed unfazed, even enjoying the tranquility. He raised his hand, picked up a pastry from the nearby table. Holding the pastry in his left hand, he gestured for me to come closer. As obediently approached, a hand cupped my cheek, and the exquisite pastry was then placed into my mouth. A faint sweetness lingered between my lips and teeth. Philip clapped his hands, casually brushing off the pastry crumbs from his fingers. How does it taste? Delicious, I nodded, and he packed up to leave. I was a bit dumbfounded. Memories of rural banquets where the aunties packed roasted chicken in plastic bags flashed through my mind. Coming back to reality, I silently gripped the wheelchair armrest. It seemed Philip's status in the Smiths was indeed very low. I used to read novels about domineering bosses, where if the female companion liked to eat something, the young masters would always have the chefs make more. But for our Philip, with a wave of his hand, it was a takeout order. The family banquet was relatively quiet. However, quiet on Philip's side, but bustling around Samuel, with people swarming around him. I couldn't help but sneak a few more glances. However, all those people seemed to have a hot face against a cold bottom. Samuel stood alone, indifferent. Except for the woman by his side, he hardly spoke to anyone. Even at a so-called family banquet, there were still tiers of hierarchy. Feeling bored, I withdrew my gaze, ready to chat with Philip casually. When I lowered my head, I happened to catch Philip looking in the distance. He wasn't looking at Samuel, but at the woman by Samuel's side. Unsurprisingly, she should be his future sister-in-law. Knowing Philip for these 2 days, he always seemed indifferent, as if nothing in the world could pique his interest. I often marveled in my heart that this man had a handsome world-weary face. However, the way he looked at that woman just now was particularly intense. It seemed Philip's feelings for this prospective sister-in-law were extraordinary. As Philip averted his gaze, I also turned my head slightly. As a qualified vase, I understood better than anyone the thoughts of my benefactor. Guessing around too much could get me fired. I thought I just needed to stick with Philip in a quiet corner until the end of the family banquet, but trouble still found its way to us. Only halfway through the banquet, a woman in a black evening gown walked over, looking around 25 or 26. Without saying a word, I could tell by her expression that she wouldn't be easy to deal with. Beautiful she was, but with a harsh demeanor. Sure enough, as the woman approached and glanced at Philip's face, she commented sarcastically, "Philip, how's the treatment of your leg going? My elder brother said you might never be able to stand up again. Don't lose heart, maybe miracles do happen in this world." Her tone was not that of a noble lady, but more akin to a village auntie gossiping while cracking watermelon seeds. How did Philip react? He didn't. He didn't even spare her a glance, letting her bark on the side while he remained calmed up, but she wouldn't give up. She casually picked up 2 glasses of wine from the nearby table, handing one to Philip. I missed your wedding, I had something else to do. Come, have a late wedding toast. However, Philip didn't take it. The woman's hand holding the glass froze in midair, looking somewhat awkward. After a pause, she looked at me. The glass that wasn't delivered was then offered to me. I glanced at Philip. Perhaps sensing my gaze, Philip calmly said, not giving her any face, Fiona, Peter's adopted daughter, confessed her feelings to me in private. I felt a bit embarrassed hearing this. Was this something that should have been shared? Judging by Philip's demeanor, he must have rejected her bluntly at the time. No wonder Fiona was so sarcastic just now. It seems she loved deeply but hated thoroughly. Fiona had been holding the glass for a while, and some people had noticed the situation at our end. Seeing no intention from Philip to stop her, I reached out to take the glass. Even if she was an adopted daughter, she was still a young lady of the Smiths. There was no reason for me to refuse the toast from a young lady. However, as I grasped the glass, Fiona let go of it prematurely. Before I could react, the glass fell onto Philip. The red wine soaked his suit, staining the white shirt underneath with crimson marks, looking particularly disheveled. The glass tumbled on Philip's body for a couple of rounds and then fell to the ground. With a crisp sound, the glass shattered, and the shards splattered onto the top of my feet, causing a sharp pain. Fiona's face changed instantly. With a frown, she sharply questioned me. I raised the glass to you out of respect for Philip. If you didn't want to drink, you could have declined. What does smashing the glass mean? Having successfully attracted the attention of everyone, she didn't forget to add a sentence to elevate the meaning of this little incident. If you have any grievances about people not attending the wedding, just say it. But this is a Smiths family banquet. Are you trying to challenge the Smiths by breaking a glass in public? Frowning, I looked at her. She had just put a high hat on me. I wanted to retort, but with Philip in mind, I glanced at him, and he still had that indifferent look. However, when I looked at him, he raised an eyebrow slightly. I wasn't sure if I was reading it wrong, but I understood the implication. Go ahead and make a fuss. I was not one to hold back, so I really did. Fiona didn't need to put a high hat on me about challenging the Smiths. This was my first time stepping into the Smiths' home, abiding by the rules of the Smiths, and had no intention of causing trouble. What happened just now was indeed an accident, but if you insist on looking for an excuse, let's just say I didn't like you. After speaking, I feigned surprise and continued in a voice that everyone in the banquet hall could hear. But, Fiona, could it be that you think I hold a grudge against you for confessing to my husband in private? Is that something I can say? Fiona's face turned from green to white. What nonsense are you talking about? Philip is my brother, how could I confess to him? And he's just a cripple, who does he think he is? She was exceptionally angry. It seemed that her private confession to Philip couldn't be brought out in the open. After all, no matter how much they might argue publicly, they were both Smith's offspring. I shrugged and looked at Philip, looking somewhat aggrieved. Philip, was I talking nonsense? Philip did not look at me, but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his lips. Fortunately, Philip affirmed my statement with a very forceful response, saying calmly, no. These 2 words expressed Philip's attitude. At the same time, he turned to look at me. Though the words were meant for me, his indifferent tone resonated with everyone in the banquet hall. The video of the confession is still there. If you're interested, go back and watch it. Looking at Fiona's face, I continued with a smile, I really want to see what confessing to your own brother looks like. Fiona is indeed well-traveled, her open-mindedness is truly admirable. Fiona had her secret exposed and couldn't hold back. We were only a step or 2 apart, and she suddenly took a step forward, raising her hand to slap me, but it didn't land. One high, one low, 2 hands tightly grasped Fiona's wrist as she tried to strike. After a few silent seconds, a gasp echoed around us. One hand belonged to Philip. Sitting in his wheelchair, his arm slightly raised, intercepting Fiona's strike. The other hand, the source of everyone's astonishment, was Samuel's. Since entering the banquet hall, Samuel had maintained a cold demeanor, automatically ignoring all greetings. He gripped Fiona's wrist, his voice sharp. What do you think you're doing? With a tone laced with reprimand, Fiona fell silent instantly. The woman who was sarcastic in front of Philip just now was now obedient and didn't dare to make a sound. Samuel didn't say much more. Or to say, his position made those few words sufficient. His gaze swept past Fiona, hesitated briefly on my face, then turned and walked away. The woman in the red dress standing next to Samuel, however, walked over. Unlike Fiona's arrogance and pride, she first nodded to Philip, then looked at me. A delicate white hand reached out to me. "Hello, I'm Samuel's fiancée, Wendy." I quickly shook hands with her. Wendy. Certainly not living up to her name. With such a simple and elegant name, she had a bewitching look. Refined in her makeup and with a smile towards me while speaking, she almost seemed ethereal. Such a woman who could captivate everyone. No wonder she could stand by Samuel. After a brief chat, Wendy also left, and I noticed that Philip's gaze had been fixated on this future sister-in-law the entire time. It never shifted. I hadn't realized he was such a sentimental person. After Wendy left, Philip remained silent but began ordering me to get him drinks. One glass after another. He frowned, seeming burdened with thoughts. Eventually, I couldn't hold back and quietly reminded him of the dangers of excessive drinking, advising him to drink moderately, or something along those lines. However, Philip glanced at me and fumbled in his pocket for a moment, pulling out a card and handing it to me. "Keep quiet." I stared at the card for 2 seconds, about to ask how much money was on it when Philip spoke up. 50,000, no password. Taking the card, I immediately fell silent, holding onto it and looking at it over and over again, feeling puzzled. Was this person some kind of card seller? How could he pull out cards of varying amounts anytime and anywhere? After a long wait, the family dinner finally concluded. I let out a sigh of relief, pushed Philip out of the Smiths, got into the car, and once inside, Philip took off his suit jacket, pinched his brows, closed his eyes, and leaned back in the chair. "Sophia." I quickly leaned over. However, as the car turned, I didn't sit stably and accidentally fell into Philip's arms. Strangely, at the moment of impact, my hand reached out instinctively, and even through his shirt, it seemed to touch his abdominal muscles. The touch was firm and defined. I was puzzled how this person had developed such muscles, doing weightlifting while in a wheelchair? Lost in thought. Philip's voice suddenly came from above my head. Had enough, I returned to my senses instantly, withdrew my hand, and sat back upright. With a self-conscious laugh, I tried to explain that I didn't sit stably due to the car turning. Philip nodded nonchalantly and opened his eyes, looking at the driver in the front seat. "Next month, a raise." The driver repeatedly expressed his gratitude, smiling discreetly, his mouth stretched to his ears, but with no real laughter. After the salary increase issue settled, I asked him quietly about why he called me earlier. Philip tilted his head, took out a finely crafted bag from somewhere, and handed it to me. Upon opening it, I found several pieces of wrapped pastries from earlier. He actually remembered. I was stunned for a moment before reaching out to take them. The private chef at the Smiths was very skilled, and these almond-flavored pastries were sweet but not cloying, incredibly delicious. Unable to resist, I picked up a piece and held it out to Philip near his mouth. "You should try it too." Philip glanced at me and, somewhat reluctantly, opened his mouth and took a bite. On the second night sharing the bed, I helped Philip onto the bed. Before getting in, an assistant took care of Philip's bathing needs, and when he emerged from the bathroom, he had changed into a set of black silk pajamas, a material similar to the ones I was wearing, a couple's edition. Only a night light was on in the room. I hurried to push Philip's wheelchair towards the bedside, forgetting to put on my shoes. It didn't feel cold to walk barefoot, I was just a bit flushed. Although Philip and I were just a contract couple, wearing matching outfits felt somewhat embarrassing. As I guided Philip to the bed, he frowned, urging me a bit more. Only once I had helped him onto the bed did he cast a glance at my bare feet on the floor, commenting, "The floor is cold." So I obediently climbed into bed. Though he had leg issues and seemed emotionally distant, he still showed care and concern. In the middle of the night, I suddenly remembered being held by Philip earlier, his warm and firm embrace. This thought kept me awake. Meanwhile, Philip slept soundly, probably due to the alcohol, even muttering in his sleep, "Sophia, that card, it's empty." After uttering those words, he fell asleep again in an instant. While clutching the bank card he had given me earlier, I found myself unable to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, he was no longer by my side. Thinking it was late, I pulled back the curtains, only to find the sky still gray outside. Checking the clock, I was surprised to see it was only 5 a.m. Letting out a yawn, I went to the bathroom, considering going back to bed for more sleep, but also a bit worried about Philip. Where had he gone so early in the morning? Wrapping my pajamas tightly, I stepped out of the room. With the night light illuminating the hallway dimly, I walked to the stairs and peeked downstairs, finding the living room empty as well. I assumed Philip must be out for something. Just as I turned to head back to the room, I suddenly heard Philip's voice. It was low and cold, but what he specifically said I couldn't discern. Following the sound, it seemed to come from a room on the side of the first floor hallway. I shouldn't have been curious and should have smartly decided to ignore it. However, inexplicably, I quietly went downstairs and walked over at the room's doorway. I stood still, holding my breath, and peeked through the slightly open door to observe the scene inside. What I saw shocked me. The usually indifferent Philip, who seemed disinterested in worldly matters, appeared different at that moment. Wearing loose black silk pajamas, he was seated in a chair, his gaze cold and intense, with a hint of malice in his eyes akin to Samuel's. If it weren't for the man kneeling on the ground in front of him, back facing me, I couldn't make out his expression. After Philip finished speaking, the man visibly tensed up but stayed silent. Philip also fell silent, just watching him while smoking. From my angle, I could see Philip's face clearly. An icy glint in his eyes. After a few days of being around him, I realized just how imposing Philip could be. Lost in thought, Philip suddenly raised his voice in the room, seemingly reminding the kneeling man to come clean. Startled by his outburst, my hand shook, unintentionally pushing the door ajar. With the door half open, Philip leapt up from his chair, full of intensity, and our eyes met slowly. The atmosphere turned awkward and tense. Hesitantly, I looked at Philip, saying, "I woke up and didn't see you, got a bit worried, so I came down to check. If you're fine, I'll head back upstairs." As I turned to leave, Philip's voice halted me. He calmly spoke, no longer casual but serious. "Wait." He grasped my wrist suddenly, and with a bit of force, I fell into his arms. He sat in the wheelchair, and I found myself on his lap. My heart raced wildly, not out of embarrassment, but tension. With his legs already impaired, would sitting like this make it worse? I hastily tried to stand, bracing myself against the wheelchair's armrest, but unknowingly pressed a button. The wheelchair started moving slowly towards the wall in front, fortunately stopped by Philip in time. Furrowing his brows, he reiterated, settling me back down. "Stay put." His tone was too cold for comfort and made me a bit fearful, so I obeyed. As the wheelchair turned toward the bed, I quickly got off, sitting on the bedside. "Let me help you get onto the bed?" I asked shyly. Philip rubbed his brows and replied, "No need, I'll sit for a while." As he spoke, his voice was calm, saying it was still early and we could sleep a bit longer. All right. After all, I had just seen Philip in action, so I dared not disobey him. I obediently followed his instructions. Indeed, it was still early, and soon drowsiness crept in. As my consciousness started to blur, it seemed like someone got into bed and laid down next to me. Without thinking, I hugged the person around the waist and wrapped my legs around him. Back at home, I loved sleeping with a giant teddy bear, always hugging it with both arms and legs. Vaguely, the person I was holding seemed to stiffen as I held onto them. When I woke up, the sunlight was already shining on my backside. I opened my eyes and met a pair of eyes. Deep and dark, those eyes seemed bottomless. Lowering my gaze, I saw Philip. He was still wearing the same black pajamas, with 2 buttons mysteriously undone at the collar, revealing his delicate and attractive collarbones. Feeling embarrassed, I quickly let go of him. "Sorry, it's just a habit of mine." But my explanation seemed to have a reverse effect. The man, who was composed just a moment ago, furrowed his eyebrows upon hearing my words, and his tone turned colder. "Who are you used to hugging like this?" I paused, then truthfully answered, "A giant teddy bear." Philip fell silent for a moment, then smirked as if laughing. "I'll have my assistant buy you a new one in a while." True to his word, as we were halfway through breakfast, Philip's assistant entered with 2 bodyguards carrying 2 teddy bears, each taller than a person, in different colors. Philip glanced at them and casually said, "Which one do you like?" "Put it on the bed." I swallowed a bite of pastry and replied, "The gray one, please." I almost didn't dare to mention that the gray one resembled Philip and must be comfortable to hold. As we were finishing breakfast, Philip's phone suddenly rang on the table. He glanced at it, then his expression turned cold. Curious, I also sneakily took a look. The screen flashed, Samuel. Philip didn't seem in a rush to pick up the call. It wasn't until the call was about to end that he casually wiped his hands clean and answered. He chose to put it on speakerphone as he couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. However, as soon as Samuel spoke, I was stunned. This conversation between the brothers had no greetings, and Samuel got straight to the point, stating that he needed a translator and wanted to borrow me. He mentioned hearing that I studied German in university and asked for my help for a date. I nearly sprayed out the coffee I had just sipped. Borrow me for a day? Isn't it a bit much? The Smiths Group, a huge company, can't even find a temporary translator. I thought the lack of a translator was fake and that there was another motive behind it. After swallowing my coffee, I turned to look at Philip. Although we were only contractually married, I still held the title of Mrs. Smith's group, and being lent as a translator by his brother didn't seem right. However, Philip remained silent for a moment before agreeing. This man was straightforward. With a simple okay, he hung up the phone without asking where I needed to go or what to prepare. 2 minutes later, Philip's phone vibrated. He was leisurely eating a medium-rare steak, the fork and knife falling to the plate, causing a streak of red. It truly was a nice appetite for an early morning. Only after finishing his plate did Philip pick up his phone. I sneaked a glance and saw that it was a message from Samuel, indicating time and location details. After breakfast, Philip accompanied me to the company, which surprised me. Rumors had it that even with 2 healthy legs, Philip was a wastrel who only knew how to party and had rarely been to the company. I had expected him to send a driver to drop me off. During our journey, Philip remained as taciturn as ever. Just before getting out of the car, he turned his head and asked, "There might be some technical jargon involved, are you confident?" Although I wanted to brag in front of the benefactor, Smith's Group's business deals were worth millions. So I could only shake my head honestly. Not really. I thought Philip would have his people find a professional translator, but he just closed his eyes and rested. He remained aloof. As we entered the conference room, Samuel and the foreign party also arrived. I quickly stood up and greeted them cautiously. Everything that followed went smoothly. However, it wasn't me who guaranteed the success, but the wastrel Philip, who was rumored to be uneducated and idle. During my school years, my grades lagged, and my German skills were average at best. After graduation, I hadn't worked in the field, so the fact that I could converse fluently was quite an achievement. Nevertheless, when it came to translating some industry-specific terms, I couldn't keep up. Each time this happened, Philip promptly intervened. Despite his indifferent demeanor, his pronunciation was impeccable. In the latter part of the meeting, the foreign client almost exclusively conversed with Philip, bypassing Samuel and me entirely. The business negotiations went smoothly, and the foreign clients directly signed a contract. Securing a multi-million-dollar deal, Philip casually sealed the agreement. From my vantage point, I could see Philip's profile. Sitting in his wheelchair, his legs may have been disabled, but his posture was straight, exuding a cool and dignified aura that commanded respect. This man, initially seeming simple, appeared more complex the more one delved into his character. It was hard to read and guess his intentions. After signing the contract, Samuel suggested that we all go for a meal, which Philip agreed to. It seemed like the relationship between these brothers was strained, full of contradictions, yet not completely severed. A new high-end private restaurant had recently opened near the company, and Samuel's assistant quickly made a reservation. Although Samuel was wealthy, he couldn't book a private room. Therefore, the 4 of us settled for a secluded table in the corner of the restaurant. The dishes arrived slowly, but the flavors certainly justified the wait. Impressed by the chef's skills, I ate with great focus. However, as I was savoring the ribs, some broth dripped. I quickly leaned down to wipe it, and as I glanced down, I saw Wendy, Samuel's fiancée and Philip's supposed future sister-in-law, softly nudging Philip's leg with her high heels under the table. I paused for a moment, then discreetly withdrew my gaze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Philip, who was focused on peeling shrimp, seemingly unaware of Wendy's flirtation. I wanted to remind her that Philip's legs were disabled. Even if she were to secretly prick his legs with needles under the table, he probably wouldn't feel it. I accidentally ate a melon, but couldn't show it, and felt choked, so I had to drink 2 sips of soup in a row. Just as I put down the spoon, a few shrimps appeared in the plate in front of me. The shrimp shells were neatly peeled and arranged. I looked up. Philip had just peeled them. He had painstakingly peeled the shrimp just for me. I glanced at Philip and then subconsciously swept my eyes over Wendy across from me. I was truly surprised and a bit overwhelmed. I whispered a thank you and was about to eat the shrimp when Philip slightly impatiently put down his chopsticks. He asked me to take him to the restaurant. I was puzzled for 2 seconds before realizing he was talking to me. I put down the shrimp and obediently agreed. All right. Although, I didn't understand why he needed me to push him when his wheelchair could be electrically controlled. I pushed him to the entrance of the men's restroom, and Philip went in alone, so I waited for him in the corridor. The corridor windows were open. With the wind blowing, I felt the urge for a smoke again, but unfortunately, I didn't have any cigarettes today. After pacing the corridor for a couple of rounds. Feeling a bit restless, suddenly a voice came from behind me, "Want a smoke?" I turned around in surprise and saw that it was Samuel again. It seemed like every time I met him, it was near the restroom. Samuel took out a cigarette from his pocket, raised an eyebrow slightly, and handed it to me. I hesitated for 2 seconds, but still accepted it. However, as soon as I lit the cigarette and took a puff, I heard Samuel beside me asking, "Have you noticed that Philip likes my fiancée?" His words startled me, and the smoke instantly choked me, making me cough uncontrollably. "No," I quickly denied as soon as I caught my breath. "You must be mistaken. Philip is already married. How could he possibly have feelings for his future sister-in-law?" I couldn't casually answer this question. Even if I felt that Philip might have some feelings, I didn't dare say it. Startled, I raised my hand to take another puff of the cigarette. But Samuel suddenly snatched it from my hand. He took a puff and then flicked the cigarette to put it out with his fingertips. Then, he cornered me against the wall, leaning in close to me, his warm breath brushing against my face. He said, "Sophia, since it's just a marriage of convenience between you two, why don't the four of us switch things up? So crazy." These words echoed in my ears, leaving me blank, with just those two words circling in my mind. Either I was going crazy, or Samuel was. Did he even know what he was saying? I swallowed hard and couldn't find words to say because suddenly, I remembered the scene I saw under the table earlier, Wendy's foot subtly rubbing against Philip's leg under the table. So maybe Philip's fondness for her wasn't just my imagination. Was there something really going on between them? I tend to get distracted easily when I start thinking about things. As I was lost in my thoughts, I heard Philip's voice coming from a distance, "Sophia." He said my name in a low, icy tone. His voice was like a tangible force, sending shivers down my spine instantly, and I felt a chill run down my back. In a split second, I pushed Samuel away a bit. At the entrance of the restroom, Philip, sitting in his wheelchair, looked at us with cold eyes, his furrowed brows showing a hint of anger. His fingers rested on the armrest, with visible tension in his hand. I hurried to explain, but as I took a step forward, my wrist was grabbed by someone. Samuel grasped my wrist and pulled me back towards him, not caring about my resistance. He pressed on my shoulder, looking at Philip with a smile, and said, "You seem to enjoy Wendy's teasing. How about we switch?" Samuel exerted great force, and as I tried to break free, his grip only tightened. My shoulders were in such pain that I almost doubted if my bones were being crushed. I stared at Philip, shook my head, and started to speak. "Philip," and before I could finish my sentence, he intervened. Philip, still in the wheelchair, came over to us. He sat there, and Samuel stood. Despite being in a lower physical position, Philip's presence exuded a strong aura. He nodded slightly, then, after locking eyes with Samuel for 2 seconds, suddenly raised his hand and seized Samuel's collar tightly. With just a little exertion, Samuel was forced to bend down. At that moment, even the head of the Smiths appeared somewhat embarrassed at Samuel. He firmly held onto his collar, his back straight. "Stop having your fiancé test me. My leg might be disabled, but it's disabled." And also, Philip stared at him, paused for 2 seconds, then suddenly smiled. He quickly let go of Samuel, patting down the creased collar. Tap by tap, the movements were neither heavy nor soft. "Let's stop these unnecessary tests. If I want to fight for the inheritance, you probably won't be in that position." With that said, Philip turned away and left, taking me along. I breathed a sigh of relief and followed quickly. As we neared the corner, I heard Samuel's low chuckle from behind. "Philip, I knew you were far more interesting than I thought to myself. These two brothers seem to have quite unusual ways of thinking." Samuel had just been warned by his own brother after being caught in a compromising situation with me, yet he didn't seem angry, but rather excited. Truly a family of odd people. Of course, feeling a bit guilty after being caught in a slightly ambiguous situation with Samuel by Philip, I didn't dare say much and just silently followed behind Philip. He left the restaurant directly. I wanted to help push his wheelchair to show my goodwill, but as I walked up behind him, he suddenly accelerated the wheelchair. I was left behind, feeling a little exasperated. He was quite spoiled. I continued to follow behind Philip. At the car door, the driver helped him get in, but just as I was about to follow, the door closed. Through the car window, I could only vaguely see his figure inside. "Philip," I called out subconsciously, but the driver quickly got into the car. The black silhouette raced past me. I watched the back of the car in disbelief, silently scolding Philip for not even giving me a chance to explain. So, I might have to take a taxi back home again. This time, I had learned my lesson and decisively avoided the futile attempt of chasing their cars. I hailed a cab on the roadside, and after around 5 minutes, I couldn't find a taxi but instead saw Philip's Rolls-Royce stopping in front of me. The car that had sped away 5 minutes ago had now returned in a circle and stopped in front of me. The window rolled down, revealing Philip's cold expression. I couldn't read his mind and didn't know what to say. After about 10 seconds, Philip slowly turned and said, "Not getting in?" I hurriedly ascended the steps he offered and got into the car. However, even in the car, Philip remained silent and distant. The atmosphere was tense, and the driver in the front seat dared not make a sound. Afraid of inadvertently provoking the Lord in the back seat. Finally, the car pulled into Philip's mansion garage. With a sigh of relief, before the driver could come to assist, I quickly got out of the car, assisting Philip into his wheelchair. As I was about to push the wheelchair, he suddenly accelerated with the electric controls and left without saying a word. Quite aloof. After being married for a few days, today was the first time I found myself alone in the empty room. Back at the mansion, Philip instructed me to go to the room while he went somewhere. Concerned about Philip's mood, I felt a bit anxious. He was the boss, and if he got upset, it would only spell trouble for me. So, I decided to check on him. But I didn't see Philip anywhere. Philip enjoyed his solitude and didn't like others appearing in his living area, so the cleaning staff came at certain times to clean the mansion. By nightfall, the vast mansion felt eerie and somewhat terrifying with empty hallways. After a brief stroll, I hurried back in my slippers. Philip still hadn't returned. Just as I was answering my mom's message, lounging in bed and feeling a bit bored, suddenly, the blanket over my head was yanked away, and before I could scream, I saw it was Philip's face in the moonlit room. He tightly held me, his lips with a hint of alcohol coming down hurriedly to kiss me. On my brows, in the corners of my eyes, and on my lips. He freed one hand and firmly held my jaw, kissing me fiercely. I was stunned, even too shocked to react that the kiss was forceful and possessive. "Sophia," he muttered my name vaguely, changing his hand from gripping my jaw to stroking my face. "I wanted to take things slow with you, but why aren't you obedient?" In that moment, I wanted to say that I was indeed obedient and it was his brother creating situations that made it seem otherwise, but before I could utter a word, he silenced me with a kiss. Philip didn't even give me a chance to explain. He propped himself up on the bed, bending down to look at me. In the moonlight, his eyes sparkled. "Sophia." As the alcohol slowly wore off, he seemed to regain some rationality. With a hoarse voice, he asked me, "Do you know why I chose you as my decorative wife instead of any other vase?" I shook my head. In fact, I didn't understand why this opportunity had fallen into my lap. Without having to sell my body or soul, just by marrying and being a decorative piece, I could obtain millions. Countless girls would probably jump at the chance for such a deal. Why did it have to happen to me? Philip remained quiet for a while. Feeling impatient, I placed my hands on his chest and asked in a low voice, "Why?" Philip's gaze swept over my features, landing on my lips. He pursed his lips, his Adam's apple rolling. I held my breath, my heart unknowingly accelerating. When Philip finally spoke, his response was, "I'll tell you later." I wanted to object, but before I could, the loose strap of my nightgown suddenly slipped off my shoulder. Philip's gaze followed the movement. In that moment of stillness, his eyes burned with intensity. I pushed him away abruptly, pulling the strap back up. Because it's getting late," I stuttered nervously. "You should get some rest." Upon hearing this, Philip chuckled. "Is this an invitation?" I blushed and shook my head, trying to speak, but he cut in before me. "Sophia, I've been drinking." So, he freed a hand, unbuttoning 2 buttons on his shirt, a hint of desire in his eyes. "It's hard to control," he added. Though he said that, he only smiled and didn't take it further. About half a minute later, he turned over and lay beside me. From start to finish, his legs remained limp, with no effort on my part, but Philip used his arms to move them the whole time. I felt a twinge of pity. So his legs were actually useless. I had wondered if it was a trick to act crippled to deceive others. After Philip lay down, he remained silent for a while. Just as I thought he was about to fall asleep, his lowered voice suddenly reached my ears. "Here's a money-making opportunity for you. Interested?" But his usually deep, melodious voice sounded hoarse. "Yes, I'm interested," I replied eagerly, prompting him to explain the opportunity. He turned his head to look at me. "Marriage certificate." "Marriage certificate?" I was taken aback, wondering why a wedding was needed when the marriage was merely a formality. "Why make it legal?" After hesitating for a moment, I cautiously asked, "Is there a time limit?" Philip was silent for a few seconds. 3 years, 10 million? He seemed uncertain, suddenly asking me. Without hesitation, I grasped his hand firmly. "Deal." Fearful that he might back out, I set my alarm clock specifically for the next morning to make sure I arrived at the Civil Affairs Bureau as soon as it opened. However, even after calming down, I couldn't suppress my doubts and asked him why. With a nonchalant tone, Philip closed his eyes, his voice returning to its usual detached state. I don't inquire about my benefactors, Philip, and I got a marriage certificate. However, to my surprise, I was too trusting of Philip's financial strength. He handed me a piece of paper, and as I unfolded it, expecting a check, I found it was an IOU. Clearly written in black ink on a white sheet of paper, it stated that Philip owed Sophia 10 million yuan, to be paid back within 3 years. I clenched the IOU, silently cursing him in my mind, this handsome, deceitful man with a limp leg. Despite my extreme anger at that moment, his face was too beautiful, and I couldn't bring myself to call him ugly. Staring at the IOU in silence for a long time, I quietly put it away. Then, while Philip was resting with his eyes closed in the car, I discreetly took a photo of the IOU with my phone, censored it, and asked online if this IOU had any legal effect. The lawyer didn't respond, but by my side, Philip spoke up. Stop searching. I will pay you back within 3 years. And by the way, Philip opened his eyes and fixed his gaze on me, saying, since we have our certificate, isn't all the money in my bank account yours? My eyes brightened. That made sense. I immediately turned off my phone, tactfully inquired about his bank card password, and Philip handed me his wallet, which contained 4 to 5 bank cards. He ran a hand across his forehead, saying casually, the passwords are all your birthday, recently changed. I unceremoniously took the bank cards. Even if Philip didn't have 10 million in his account, there had to be several million. Now that we had the certificate and Philip had spoken, I could rightly consider it our shared marital property. Philip was not a simpleton. Later, I made up an excuse to have Philip leave me at a nearby shopping mall, pretending to go shopping, then sneaked off to the bank. The balance on 5 bank cards added up to less than $1 million. Now, I seriously doubted if Philip was possibly the illegitimate child of the Smiths. However, given the standard of the Smiths, even an illegitimate child shouldn't have lived so down and out. As I stared at the balances, feeling like crying but unable to shed a tear, I suddenly received a call from Philip. He said his father was back and wanted to meet me. I instantly felt weak in the legs. Before marrying Philip, I may not have heard of Philip and Samuel, but his father's reputation was undoubtedly well known. Formerly known as Peter, he had a background in literature and was a famous writer who eventually shifted to business, making a big splash with his first venture. As his business grew, he became one of the most renowned entrepreneurs in the city. Peter was now aging, but in his younger days, he was known for his rigorous and decisive actions in the business world. I had seen his news segments, and even seeing a few minutes of his interviews through the screen. The coldness in his eyes and demeanor was chilling. Recalling all the relevant information I could find about Peter in my mind, I asked with a trembling voice, can I not go see him? Philip, on the other hand, sounded nonchalant. Guess? I assumed that it definitely wasn't an option. Trying to comfort me, Philip said, don't worry, he's very kind. Those words left me feeling utterly helpless. Nevertheless, no matter how afraid I was, I had to face it. I mustered up my courage and bought a somewhat decent dress in the mall. Just as I stepped out, I saw Philip's car parked on the roadside. Getting into the car, I felt a bit nervous. Clutching the edge of my dress, I inquired about how far was Peter's residence from there. I had heard Peter preferred living alone and rarely stayed at the Smiths estate I had visited the last time. It's okay, Philip replied in a casual tone. When he said it was okay, I assumed we would need at least a 20-minute ride, but then he said matter-of-factly that the car had stopped. To be more precise, I got into the car at the mall entrance, and the car made a U-turn, heading straight into a nearby residential area. Though situated in a commercial district, this villa area had a large footprint, effectively isolating the residents from the outside world, making it quiet and pristine. I'd come across this residential area online and was astounded by its exorbitant prices, making every inch of land a luxury. I haven't even prepared yet, and we're already here. I felt even more nervous. Fidgeting with my dress hem, I tugged on it, took deep breaths, and followed Philip as he got out of the car. I accompanied him, obediently pushing the wheelchair, even though he didn't require it. As we entered through the gate, the courtyard was vast, with only a few flowers and plants planted. Once inside, the spacious living room was devoid of people. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking perhaps Peter happened to be out. Just as I thought that, I heard footsteps coming from the direction of the kitchen. After a few seconds, an elderly man holding a spatula appeared at the doorway. His hair had turned somewhat white, but he still looked radiant. To my surprise, he wore a black apron around his waist, and his face seemed to slowly align with the cold and ruthless man in my memory from the news segments. Yet, the fabled god of death I had heard of was now standing there with a smile, his voice like a loud bell. Philip, Dad made your favorite fish. Try the broth? Philip furrowed his brow, pushing the spatula away. At the same moment, he grabbed my wrist, pulling me over. Your daughter-in-law, Sophia, he said. My heart leaped to my throat. I stuttered with a peep before realizing it was improper and forced out, Dad. Who would have thought that the fierce and lethal Peter, rumored to be able to take lives, would now have this demeanor in private, with hardly a chance to utter a single word of greetings in the rushed preparations? Peter, holding a spatula in one hand and clasping my hand with the other, greeted me warmly. Smiling broadly, he let go of my hand, reaching for 2 boxes on the nearby coffee table, presenting them to me as a welcome gift. One of the boxes was notably large. Unable to refuse, I reluctantly accepted them. The weight suggested they were quite heavy. Peter gestured for me to sit on the sofa and then turned back to the kitchen, mentioning he would prepare some of his specialty dishes for us to try. He finished speaking and returned to the kitchen, leaving me in a state of disbelief. Peter, the man capable of making the entire commercial district tremble just by stomping his foot, was now so amiable and approachable behind closed doors. Turning to me, Philip looked nonchalant. I've told you before, he's kind-hearted. And he loves cooking various dishes for me in private. I was left speechless, because my attention was once again drawn to the large box Peter had given me a moment ago. I opened it and almost got blinded by my eyes. Shining brightly, it was all gold bars. I swallowed hard. The gift was indeed extravagant and unique. Beside me, Philip poured me a cup of tea in a nonchalant tone. This is just an appetizer, open that small box. I obediently did as I was told and opened another jewelry box. It was a jade bracelet. I have some interest in jade usually and know a little about it. Staring at the jade bracelet in front of me, my throat felt dry. Philip was right. Compared to it, those few pounds of gold bars were just an appetizer. After looking at it for a while, I carefully closed the lid. I was usually okay with deceiving Philip for money, but this gift from Peter really made me nervous. After hesitating for a while, despite being scared, I chose to go to the kitchen to help out. Unexpectedly, Peter did not rush me out. On the contrary, we surprisingly got along very well. Peter was down to earth in private, being a chef, and I assisting. Our cooperation was surprisingly tacit. Also, Peter was truly versatile, being good at both academics and business. Even cooking was his expertise. After making a few dishes, the house was filled with delicious aromas. The 3 of us, with Peter eventually preparing 6 dishes and a soup, all home-cooked dishes. Peter invited us to sit down for the meal and repeatedly urged me to relax, reminding me that today he was just an ordinary father, not a high-profile executive. After a few times, I really started to relax gradually. The way Peter doted on Philip was truly evident. The tough and decisive Peter, in rumors, was busy at the dinner table peeling shrimp and serving fish to his son, encouraging him to try his cooking. He even asked Philip if he wanted to hear an interesting story Peter encountered abroad last month. However, Philip seemed indifferent, maintaining his aloof demeanor, occasionally nodding in response to Peter's words. Watching Peter's doting on his son across the table, I finally believed what Philip had told Samuel that day. He said, if he wanted to take the heir position, Samuel wouldn't stand a chance. At that time, I only felt Philip's words were domineering, but now I realized they were probably true. As I was thinking, Peter seemed to sense it and brought up the matter. He sighed, worried, asking Philip when he planned on taking over his position. When faced with his son, Peter was helpless yet indulgent. However, Philip seemed uninterested in the topic. As soon as Peter mentioned it, he put down his chopsticks and wheeled himself to the restroom. As Philip left, I felt uncomfortable continuing the meal and had to put down my chopsticks, pretending to calmly sip on the tea. However, before I could finish the tea, Peter's expression changed. The previously kind demeanor vanished, replaced by cold eyes staring at me intently with a cutting-edge look. He held the teacup, rubbing the rim with his fingers, and slowly asked, "What does your mother want to do?" I was stunned. What did that have to do with my mother? Peter looked at me for a long moment. Under the piercing gaze, I felt a chill down my spine, sweat drenched my body in an instant. It felt like a long time before Peter finally looked away, furrowing his brows, and then relaxing them. After a while, he sighed. She really didn't tell you anything. I couldn't comprehend. So, what should my mother have told me? Unable to resist curiosity, I cautiously inquired, expecting Peter not to disclose much, but unexpectedly, he briefly told me a long-hidden secret. My mother was Peter's ex-girlfriend. While Peter was a little old, he was not particularly old. Peter was not yet 70 years old, while my mother was nearly 20 years younger. Nevertheless, when he was young, he was charming and wealthy. My mother had, against all odds, a passionate affair with him. However, she was tragically betrayed by him and discovered he was already married. Due to Peter's betrayal, she has remained alone till now and cannot conceive. When she left back then, she sought fierce revenge on Peter. She couldn't conceive, so how did I come into the picture? I was picked up from an orphanage by her. I knew this from a young age. The series of long-hidden secrets shocked me speechless, and while I wanted to speak, I just opened and closed my mouth silently. What should I say? It seemed inappropriate to say anything at that moment. While lost in silence, Philip happened to return. For some unknown reason, his wheelchair stopped beside me, and I felt a sense of reassurance. My heart also calmed down a bit. He turned to me, asked in a calm tone, "Why aren't you eating? Haven't you come to speak?" Before I could respond, he answered himself. "Is it not to your liking?" As he spoke, he looked up at Peter, suggesting he needed to improve his culinary skills. Glancing over, Peter had already resumed his kind demeanor and nodded in agreement. Peter even made a phone call immediately, instructing his assistant to buy some culinary books within half an hour, wanting to improve his skills. However, Philip was not too impressed. He dropped his chopsticks and directly left with me. As we left, Peter kept talking affectionately, urging Philip to visit him more often. He said he felt lonely. But Philip never turned back. Philip took me to a hot pot restaurant. He mentioned, last time he had heard me talk about wanting to eat hot pot. Lost in the steamy atmosphere, my mind echoed with all the secrets Peter had just told me. I had never imagined that my mother and the high-profile businessman Peter had such legendary affairs in the business circle. Lost in thought, a hand appeared in my field of vision. It was slender and beautiful. The person handed me a bowl of well-prepared dipping sauce, my favorite sesame sauce dip. Philip looked at me, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Do you have something on your mind?" I nodded and then shook my head. The things Peter had told me, I dared not speak of them without caution. But Philip seemed to guess. Taking a sip of tea, he spoke softly, "He's told you everything." It was a statement of certainty. While lost in my thoughts, Philip called the server to change the tea into wine. As he poured the wine, he looked at me and smiled slightly. Peter wasn't honest enough. There were certainly things he hadn't told me. Handing me the wine glass, he asked, "Do you want to hear?" I took the wine glass, nodded honestly, yes. Philip was a person who could handle secrets, and he really spoke up. Next, we ate 3 plates of meat rolls, drank 5 bottles of beer, and he elaborated on the love and hatred between Peter and my mother over the years. The earlier part was more or less the same. Peter was unfaithful and played with my mother's feelings, leaving her when she was pregnant with his child, giving her a large sum as separation payment just in time. My mother only found out then that he already had a wife. Stubborn and unwilling to undergo surgery, my mother wanted to keep the child in her womb. But how could Peter let her use the unborn child as leverage with his temperament? He staged an accident, causing my mother to have a car accident and lose the child. However, accidents are difficult to control. My mother was seriously injured, her uterus had to be removed, leaving her without the ability to conceive for the rest of her life. Moreover, while Peter briefly passed over how he hurt my mother, he didn't mention how she retaliated against him. He left that unspoken, and his son mentioned it instead. My mother was ruthless. After that incident, she was despondent for a long time, crying daily, and even attempted suicide several times. After being rescued from her suicide attempts, she seemed to have regained a new life, no longer gloomy. On the contrary, she actively approached Peter again. Overlooking past grievances. She cried her heart out and clung to Peter for dear life. My mother was a charming woman, which was why she captivated the experienced and sophisticated Peter. However, when they were being intimate, my mother pulled out a pair of scissors she had prepared in advance and attacked him. From that point on, the once charming Peter could no longer enjoy his love life. Fortunately, his wife gave birth to a child for him. At least, he had an heir. Unfortunately, the child turned out spoiled and untamed, playing around the countryside at 17, accidentally falling into the water and drowning. Peter, who rarely shed tears, wept uncontrollably multiple times. Later, he adopted Samuel and began searching the world for Philip, a child he had fathered with someone while being promiscuous in his youth. Later, Philip was found and taken back to the Smiths. However, Philip detested his illegitimate identity and forbade Peter from revealing it to the world, insisting that Peter introduce him as his newly adopted son. As people age, the grandiosity and arrogance of the past have long dissipated. In public, Peter still exudes the same authority as before, but behind closed doors, he treasured this lone son of his dearly. No matter what Philip said, Peter would agree with a smiling face. Including when he proposed to marry me. With Peter's capabilities, he could have easily known my true identity from the beginning, yet he couldn't resist pampering his beloved son. He didn't attend the wedding because Philip didn't allow it. After the story was told, my heart was still pounding uncontrollably. I took a big sip of cold beer, feeling the coolness slide down my throat, and I just wanted to say, my mom is amazing. Taking down the rumored iron-fisted tycoon, she truly had her way. No wonder, when my mom was mentioned at the table just now, Peter was still so emotionally stirred even after decades. But I was even more emotional. After eating and drinking our fill, Philip settled the bill and took me home. I followed behind him, pushing the wheelchair, wanting to ask him something, but ultimately hesitated. Silence all the way. Back home, upstairs. We mutually headed back to the bedroom. I helped him onto the bed, and then I sat on the other side. After a moment of silence, I couldn't hold back my doubts any longer and finally asked, "So, did you know my true identity from the beginning?" Philip turned to look at me, his pure black pupils as deep as an abyss. He nodded. "Yes." "Did you marry me on purpose?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. I bit my lip and asked softly, "To get back at your dad?" It was evident that Philip resented Peter. Even though Peter now treated him as a cherished possession, showering him with affection and attention. To my surprise, Philip shook his head. "No," he said. He looked me in the eyes and continued, "I intentionally agreed to marry you, but not to spite him." "Then why?" I didn't understand. What other reason could there be for Philip to intentionally agree to marry me, despite being physically disabled? With his handsome face and status, numerous beautiful girls would willingly approach him. At a gesture of his hand, countless girls prettier than me would eagerly cater to him. So why me, specifically? Philip looked down at me. He gave me an answer, yet it seemed incomplete. He said, "Because I wanted to marry you, but I was afraid of scaring you away, so I found an excuse for a mutual marriage agreement." I was shocked by this revelation and couldn't regain my composure for a long while. On our wedding day, wasn't it the first time we met? Philip stared at me for a while, pinching the bridge of his nose with his slender fingers, and sighed helplessly. "So, you really never recognized me?" I was puzzled. What was I supposed to recognize about him? He was the second son of the Smiths, while I was just a child from an ordinary family, adopted into another. If not for this marriage transaction, we would have been people from two different worlds, impossible to connect. Philip gestured for me to come closer. Since he had limited mobility, I obediently moved closer and sat beside him. Philip lifted his hand and gently placed it on my head, patting it. "Sophia, I've told you before, I am Peter's illegitimate son from his youth." "Do you know where I grew up?" I shook my head. He spoke slowly, "In the orphanage." My body stiffened, carefully examining Philip's features, trying to match the face before me with a distant memory. It seemed somewhat similar, yet I couldn't believe it. I seemed to have guessed his true identity. I pointed at him and then at myself, wanting to speak, but my voice failed me suddenly. Philip's hand rested on the tips of my hair, gently stroking it. He began to speak. His voice quivered slightly. "It seems you still remember me." And my tears also started to fall. Of course, I remember. He wasn't called Philip back then. And I wasn't called Sophia. I was abandoned at birth, without a surname, and the orphanage director named me Joy. I grew up as a wild child in the orphanage from a young age, but he originally had a mother, until she abandoned him. When he was brought back to the orphanage, he was just 6 years old. The little boy in my memory had a handsome face, but looked exceptionally thin and pale, clearly suffering from malnutrition after being abandoned. He was fragile, sensitive, weak, and timid back then. It was as if one strong breeze could blow him away. So, as a new member of the orphanage, he was bullied by a group of children until I couldn't stand it and saved him from a group of boys. I was always the king among children, but initially, to save him, I also got into fights with those troublemakers. After a few instances where I defeated 800 enemies but also harmed myself, those troublemakers were finally intimidated by me and stopped bullying Philip. And then, Philip became my little follower. Even when I went to the bathroom, he would squat outside the door waiting. When sleeping, his bed was next to mine, and he had to hold my hand secretly to fall asleep. He was a child who lacked a sense of security excessively. At least, he was like that back then. Under my careful guidance, the timid Philip evolved from a weak lamb into a little wolf. He grew taller, gained some weight, and his once tender face became much more attractive. And At some point, he transformed from that fearful boy into one of the best fighters in the orphanage. If anyone dared to say a bad word about me, he would rush over with a clenched fist, displaying a fierce demeanor ready to fight. Over time, no one dared to provoke us in the orphanage, nor did anyone pay us any attention. I was somewhat lonely, but Philip was content with the peace. It seemed, being by my side every day was all he needed. But good times never last. For a while, I noticed that Philip seemed to have changed. He started to appear absent-minded, easily startled, and began to refuse my touch. I was initially angry, but later I accidentally discovered that it was the orphanage director. The seemingly gentle and kind middle-aged female orphanage director had a pedophilic nature. And the now delicate and refined Philip naturally became her new target. That night, Philip ran away from the orphanage, and we didn't even have a chance to say a word to each other before he left. After that, I never saw Philip again. Later on, I often thought of him. I always thought that Philip was probably no longer alive. In those days of destitution, how would that sensitive and rebellious 6-year-old boy survive after running away from the orphanage? I often thought. There should be other boys in the orphanage like the young boy from back then, right? Pale, fragile, with an extreme lack of security. But sometimes, I would sadly wonder. Maybe there were no longer boys as handsome as him. Even though his features hadn't fully developed, he still astonished everyone. Astonished to the point that, years later, when I had grown up, occasionally reminiscing about the boy in my memories, I would always remember those deer-like eyes. Hence, as an adult, I became very fond of money. All the money I earned was donated to the orphanage. Of course, not to the same one as before. The former orphanage director later accidentally killed a boy in the orphanage, and her series of crimes were eventually exposed, leading to her imprisonment. These were all events that transpired after I left the orphanage. I pulled myself out of the memories, leaning against the head of the bed, quietly listening to Philip recount his life after leaving. He said that after fleeing the orphanage, he wandered the streets but didn't venture too far. He was afraid of going too far and never seeing me again. He often sneaked back to see me. At the orphanage's gate, under the cover of night. But he didn't dare to meet me, fearing that if discovered, I would be implicated, and he couldn't bear to leave once he saw me. It was only until later when I was adopted. And it was my mom who adopted me. After I was adopted, Philip secretly followed, observing from a distance for a while. But my mom treated me well, pouring all her thoughts and emotions into me. I lived a happy life. She never got involved in any romantic relationships, always raising me on her own. Only then did Philip feel at ease to leave. And I, at the age of 7 when I left the orphanage, was brought back home by my mom and grew up in love. My mom was a woman who lived passionately. She had clear likes and dislikes, loved wealth and vanity. Yet was willing to spend $3 to buy me bread when she only had $5 left, give me $1 to buy water, and then donate the remaining $1 to a poor beggar on the roadside. She was extremely beautiful and loved to wear the kind of bright red that ordinary people found difficult to pull off. Her whole life was like a bright red rose blossoming fervently. Glamorous and dazzling. Now, I realized that perhaps she had married me to Philip for another purpose, but I still don't resent her. Without her, there wouldn't be the Sophia of today. The night was quiet, and Philip's voice was deep and melodic as he continued to tell me his story. However, he seemed to gloss over the later events, with just a few passing remarks. He didn't want to delve into the embarrassing and painful memories, and I didn't want to pry. He said that later, his mom found him as he wandered and struggled on the streets. Long time had passed since he last cried, but now tears were welling up in his eyes, as he thought his mother had come to take him home. However, she took him shopping for new clothes and treated him to a nice meal. Then, she took him to the Smiths to confront Peter and demand recognition. She claimed it was for recognition, but deep down she knew it was not possible. She was only using Philip to ask for money. However, she overestimated Philip's place in Peter's heart and underestimated how ruthless he could be. Peter was not one to be controlled, just like when he arranged the accident that took Philip's mother's life. After sending Philip and his mother away, he paid a large sum of money to have an accident arranged for Philip's birth mother. It was Philip who saved her. But in doing so, he ended up with permanent disabilities in both legs. Despite his efforts, he couldn't save her. He hadn't even had the chance to fully experience the love of a mother before losing her forever. He hated his mother, and he hated Peter even more. Despite being his own flesh and blood, Peter sent him to a private hospital where he received the best medical care and a large sum of money deposited into his account, enough for him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Yet, even with his wealth, he couldn't heal Philip's legs. Philip eventually left, and, with the capital he had, the man in the wheelchair managed to carve out a place for himself in the underground business world. As he recounted these events, Philip furrowed his brow slightly, a hint of fierceness passing through his eyes, resembling the young boy he once was. A few seconds later, Philip quickly composed himself and continued his story. He said, in the past few years, after Peter's beloved son from his late wife had tragically passed away, leaving him childless, he remembered he had an illegitimate son somewhere out there. After pulling all the strings, Peter found him. Unfortunately, Philip refused to acknowledge their relationship and forbade Peter from telling anyone about it. Despite knowing Philip harbored resentment towards him, Peter cautiously tried to mend their relationship and make amends. However, after years of wandering and indifference, and after knowing that Philip was with his mother, Peter still had someone create another accident. In all honesty, Peter had never cared about Philip's well-being. He didn't want to kill him, but if Philip had perished in the accident, Peter wouldn't have been upset either. The story progressed to the point where Peter arranged for Philip to choose a wife, and my mother took the initiative to approach him. She jokingly introduced the idea of a marriage to him, with me as the bride. Philip agreed immediately. My mother demanded 10 million as dowry, and Philip didn't hesitate to accept. 10 minutes before the wedding, supposed to be a moment to exchange feelings, turned out to be the first official meeting between us after all these years. Looking back on everything now with my current mindset, I suddenly understood Philip's past gestures of kindness. For example, at the Smiths banquet, I casually mentioned enjoying a particular dessert, and he actually had it packed for me to take home. As I listened barefoot from the stairs, he didn't scold me but pulled me onto his lap, worried about my feet being cold. When Samuel tried to flirt with me, the look of fury in Philip's eyes was unmistakable. It turns out, it was all genuine. That night, Philip brought out some wine. We drank a lot and talked a lot. Eventually, we both had too much to drink. In a lonely night, under the influence of alcohol, two people baring their hearts, it was easy for something to happen. Like him kissing me on the lips. And like me trembling, closing my eyes, and responding willingly. Rumors spread that Philip was not capable, but there were also rumors suggesting that Philip's leg disability was all an act. However, that rumor was false as well. Philip did have issues with his legs. However, while being tender, he whispered by my ear, assuring me that his legs could still be treated. He mentioned that if he weren't sure his legs could be healed, he wouldn't have married me. I wanted to shake my head and say it didn't matter, that I would accept him no matter what. But before I could speak, his lips silenced me, and I couldn't utter a word. The moonlight that night was especially gentle, just like Philip. The past came to light, and what began as a contractual marriage between me and Philip turned into a real marriage. The wedding took place, the vows were exchanged, and now we had a genuine marriage. What started as a marriage of convenience had become a true union. After that night, Philip seemed to transform into a different person. In front of others, he remained distant and aloof. But when it was just the two of us, he became the loyal companion he once was. A few days later, coinciding with Peter's birthday, the grand party was nothing like the previous family banquet. 2 days before the event, Peter had called Philip, cautious and asking if he would attend. Philip, seemingly indifferent, glanced at me and only agreed after seeing me nod. On the day of the birthday celebration, Philip held my hand as we entered together. The party was held at a hotel under the Smiths Group, with a grand hall capable of accommodating thousands of guests. As Philip's figure appeared at the entrance, Peter approached him. However, halfway there, Philip's cold gaze forced Peter to retreat, stopping in his tracks with a forced smile before turning back. The guests looked confused, but didn't dwell on it too much. After all, in the eyes of the world, Philip was just an unfavored, disabled adopted son. Fiona walked over once again, greeting Philip with a smile but harboring hidden resentment and fondness. She was an awkward woman who loved Philip wholeheartedly but carried herself with pride and taunted him. It was her way of not appearing as the pitiful one unable to win his love. Fiona's mockery went unnoticed by Philip until she directed it towards me. Fiona made fun of my dress that day and sneered, saying I wasn't up to PR. I didn't pay much attention to it, but the temperature around us suddenly dropped. I turned to see Philip's expression, now cold and stern. In front of all the guests, he directly retaliated for me, shooting a glance at Fiona and reassuring me, it's okay. Everyone has a different definition of elegance. Maybe in her eyes, a thick waist and short neck are the standards of elegance. On the other side, Fiona touched her neck, feeling embarrassed and angered, almost on the verge of tears. She couldn't act out, but Samuel promptly came over to support her, subtly backing her up under the guise of maintaining the peace. With a stern face. Playing the role of the protective big brother, Samuel chastised us for creating an awkward situation on Peter's birthday. As he spoke, Philip's patience wore thin, and he interrupted, "Are you done?" Without another word, Philip took my hand and led me straight to the center of the hall. In the midst of the hall, surrounded by the attendees, Peter stood at the heart of the gathering, his gaze fixed on his son. It was a tragic sight. A man who had been ruthless in his youth, tainted by power and wealth, was now seeking familial love in his old age, longing for simple joys and the warmth of his children's affection. Peter's companion had passed away, his firstborn was dead due to an accident, and the only blood relation left, who resented him and had been disabled by his actions, was not exactly comforting. For him now, this seemed far more painful than any financial loss he had endured. Philip's habit led us to a secluded spot, away from the crowd. As I glanced at Wendy in the distance, a sense of unease enveloped me. I tugged at Philip's sleeve and softly asked if he had feelings for Wendy in the past. Philip was taken aback. Turning to me with a serious expression, he asked, "Who told you that?" "No one, I just guessed," I replied, recounting the scene from the family banquet where I noticed Philip looking at Wendy. Philip chuckled and said, "No, I didn't." He took a sip of his drink and explained to me, "She's like an older sister without blood ties. When I was lost and struggling, she helped me a lot, and later, she met Samuel through me." Sighing, Philip continued, "At that time, seeing her following Samuel like that made me sad. I always felt guilty. Samuel had no intentions towards her, and I felt regret for pushing her into that situation." However, as I paused, pondering the intense look in Philip's eyes when he gazed at Wendy, Philip laughed at my revelations. He patted my hand gently and teased, "You have too much internal drama." It was just me feeling sorry for someone who had helped me and who felt like a sister to me, getting dragged into this mess with Samuel. I stopped for a moment, recalling the fervor in Philip's eyes when he looked at Wendy. Philip chuckled and shook his head. "No, nothing like that. You're imagining too much. It was just the regret of seeing someone who had helped me, like a sister, going through a rough time because of me and Samuel." As the moon shone gently that night, and Philip's gaze softened, it seemed that our paths were intertwined more deeply than we had realized. I sighed in relief, but I could also understand Philip's feelings. It was all related to childhood experiences. Philip was actually someone who seemed cold on the outside, but was warm on the inside. He remembered everyone who had helped him deeply. Of course, the same went for those who had wronged him. But I was a bit confused. All you need to do is reveal your true identity and warn Samuel to treat Wendy better, and he surely wouldn't dare not to listen. Philip shook his head. Matters of the heart couldn't be controlled with just force. It always takes two to tango. He just felt that what she asked for was beyond his capabilities, but her choices were her own, and he wouldn't intervene. I listened attentively, nodding along. Philip was truly a level-headed person. And as I remained silent, Philip suddenly tugged at my sleeve. When I looked down, he grabbed my wrist, applying a bit of force. I was forced to bend down. Philip looked up at me, his eyes filled with heat. We locked eyes for less than 3 seconds, his Adam's apple rolling in his throat, and then he kissed me on the lips. The touch was warm. He then released my hand, and I stood up in a daze, not understanding why he had suddenly kissed me. "Remember this," he said lightly, with a hint of amusement in his eyes. "The look in your eyes just now can be considered passionate. Looking at others, it isn't the same." My face turned red, not expecting him to care about this. While the atmosphere on our side was intense, on the other side, Peter took advantage of the birthday banquet to publicly announce something. His adopted son Philip was actually his biological son. The banquet hall fell silent for a few seconds before exploding. Everyone in the city knew that Peter had no biological children, with his only son having tragically passed away in an accident. The Smiths family only had 3 adopted sons and daughters, with the disabled Philip being the least favored. Everyone had been convinced that Samuel was the heir to the Smiths group. But now, with Philip's sudden revelation, becoming Peter's biological son, the people in the banquet hall were uneasy. In these past years, everyone had been actively reaching out to Samuel to please him, and in the previous banquets where both adopted sons were present, people often intentionally ignored Philip to curry favor with Samuel. But they had all placed their bets on the wrong person. What they thought was the highlight of the birthday banquet turned out to be a bombshell revelation. As tensions rose, my mother suddenly made a grand entrance. She was carefully dressed, wearing a red dress that caught everyone's attention. Her long wavy hair and fiery red lips stood out boldly in the room, the intense red color somehow not appearing gaudy but rather accentuating her charm to its fullest. Though nearing 50, the years had left their marks on her face, but they had also added a touch of allure. She walked up to me, her gaze lingering on our intertwined hands with a smile. Without speaking to me, she walked straight to Peter. The two of them stared at each other. I had expected Peter to explode in anger, but he didn't. He simply observed her quietly, saying "You've come," as if her arrival had been expected. With my mother's appearance, the birthday banquet mingling with business tycoons hastily concluded. Peter went upstairs with her. What they discussed up there, no one knew. Neither did Philip and I. It wasn't until the next day that I got a call from the police station my mother had been incarcerated. She had turned herself in. According to her confession, she had killed a person years ago, Peter's biological son. The young Smith's scion who hadn't lived to see his 18th birthday. Back then, the 17-year-old youth was living a pampered life, being spoiled and arrogant. Peter had lost his ability to have children, and naturally, he doted on this only son, fulfilling his every wish and need with lavish indulgence. And that self-indulgent son, at 17, had run off to the countryside without Peter's knowledge, excitedly exploring new surroundings. One night, in the countryside, he met a young girl. When forced advances didn't work, he used a stone to knock her unconscious. But the girl's mother arrived, and in the scuffle, pushed him into the river. And that girl was me. I was knocked unconscious by the stone that night, and when I woke up, I was back home in the city. My mother, with a calm expression, told me she had arrived in time and chased the jerk away. For me, that incident was simply forgotten. Little did I know, she had actually killed someone that night, and I had no idea that the victim was Peter's son, the terrifying scion of the Smiths family. It was truly a twisted fate. He had deceived and wronged her, leaving her desolate about love for a lifetime, causing her to lose her child and undergo surgery that made her unable to conceive. And she had indirectly caused his downfall, and in a tragic twist of fate, ended up killing his son. I rushed to the police station, wanting to see her. But I was informed by the police that my mother had no desire to see me. After several unsuccessful attempts, I had to return home. I asked Philip to help me get the best lawyer, but my mother did not live to see that day. She hadn't even been sentenced before she passed away in custody. It wasn't suicide. The prison was closely monitored, and she had no opportunity to take her own life. She died from a sudden onset of cancer, and it was only then that I learned she had late-stage lung cancer. Late to the stage where treatment was nearly futile. I had only recently discovered her secret, and hadn't even had the chance to ask her about it before being overwhelmed by this series of events. Without Philip, I might have found it difficult to move forward. Philip stood by my side as a son-in-law, supportive through it all. At the funeral, I stared blankly at my mother's black and white portrait. The photo was devoid of color, but looking at that face always made me involuntarily think of the red dress. Her existence seemed to naturally embody color. A vibrant person reduced to grayscale. After the funeral, I returned home. I had wanted to go to my mother's bedroom to look around, but then I unexpectedly found a letter she had left for me. It turned out, everything had been part of her plan. Before her death, she wanted to see me married, to the right person. Someone I had known since childhood, someone I had not seen in years but who had always been in my thoughts. Someone who, despite his disability, was supremely capable and could protect me. Before her passing, she wanted to see Peter one last time, and then perhaps that man whom she had loved and hated for a lifetime. In the letter, she talked about her life. She had wanted to live brightly, but she happened to meet Peter. When they first met, she was in her early 20s, at the prime of her youth. While he was mature and steady, having passed middle age. He could easily control her without making a sound. Their disputes and entanglements had lasted a lifetime. She revealed that night in the countryside in the letter. She arrived to find me with half my clothes removed. If she had been even a bit later, I might not have remained unharmed. Angered, she had a confrontation with the person, accidentally pushing him into the river. He couldn't swim, and as he struggled in the river, she had been ready to jump in and rescue him. But under the moonlight, she saw his face clearly. The scoundrel who had wanted to defile her daughter was Peter's son. Truly, a case of fate playing cruel tricks. That night, she stood by the river for a long time, facing inner conflict and hesitation, but ultimately she didn't jump in. She let that lustful young man sink into the river under the moonlight. In the latter part of the letter, she revealed why she had chosen Philip for me. She had investigated and knew that Philip and I had been together in the welfare home and had a good relationship. She also knew about Philip's covert vigilance and protection over the years. That was why she entrusted me to him. As for using me for revenge against Peter, she had never considered it. My mother was as capricious and carefree as her writing. The letter was several pages long, and I could even discern her tone between the lines. She wrote that all the enmities and disputes in their lives were none of my concern. On the last half sheet of paper, with only one sentence written, it made me burst into tears instantly. Her writing was casual and hasty, but that sentence revealed her every intention. She had written, "I couldn't bear children in this lifetime. Thank you for being my child." Holding the paper tightly, tears streamed down my face. The person to be thankful for was me. Abandoned at birth, I was grateful to her for raising me despite lacking any blood relation. Before I was born, I selected a mother from above. I had chosen the wrong person and had been innocently abandoned. 7 years later, she brought me back home, rectifying my past mistakes that also left behind with the letter was a bank card, with my birthday as the password. Inside were her life savings and the bride price that Philip had given. Untouched, she kept them for me. It was a coincidence that on the 7th day of my mother's passing, Peter also passed away. He died peacefully in his sleep, discovered by the housemaid, already departed. Upon receiving the news, Philip remained silent. He quietly hung up the phone, quietly came to see Peter one last time, and finally, in silence, carried out the funeral. Peter had made preparations long ago and had left a will with his lawyer, leaving all his property to Philip. Samuel and Fiona, apart from being known as Peter's adopted son and daughter, did not receive a penny. This action indeed aligned with Peter's style of behavior throughout his life. The merchant cared more for profit than parting ways. Not only did he part coldly, but he was also exceptionally ruthless. He was the epitome of selfishness, always self-centered. Even in death, he would not leave a single cent of his estate to his adopted children. Not even a symbolic portion. Hence, Samuel and Fiona were nowhere to be seen at the funeral. After the funeral, the guests were sent off, and Philip's wheelchair stopped in front of the tombstone. He lowered his head and silently gazed at the black and white photo on it. I stood by, silent, unsure of what to say. Time passed. A breeze blew by. Philip suddenly spoke, a hint of sarcasm in his tone, questioning why he had tried so hard to please me in the final years of his life. Was it to make amends for something? Philip shook his head. It was to make amends for his own shortcomings. He had never, ever loved me, his biological son. Even when he carefully tried to please me, to make amends for me, it was all for himself. Throughout his life, he had achieved power, but the only regret he had was in terms of offspring. He had lost his ability to bear children, and his most beloved son died in an accident. He should have grown old in loneliness, but fortunately there was me, his illegitimate son, bringing him some consolation. So he desperately tried to please me, to compensate for me, just aiming to make up for his own deficiencies, so that his later years didn't seem so pitiful. Philip smirked, his face tinged with mockery. But those eyes were slightly red. He had always been fond of only himself. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to please, he remained pitiful. Throughout his life, there was not a single person who truly cared for him. His legal wife was loyal to him but was driven to depression by his coldness and infidelity, and his mother loved him but was misled by him all her life. If one day he were to go bankrupt, no one would be willing to spare him a second glance, and he would be alone and ostracized by all. Philip chuckled, a bitter kind of amusement. Nevertheless, on that day, a tear fell from Philip's eye in front of Peter's tombstone. He said that tear was his way of bidding him farewell, of cutting off all the unbearable past. All the grudges and hatred, all the animosities and complaints, were all extinguished with his death. What he had left us was a brand new future. Our next plan was Philip's treatment. The treatment went smoothly, yet there was a slight, unexpected turn. 2 lines appeared in the bathroom in my house. Mine. I was pregnant. The sudden arrival of a child disrupted our plans, but it also made us feel more hopeful. It seemed that all the past trials had led to a new beginning. Just like the new life growing inside me. Since then, Philip's favorite thing to do was to think of names. Thanks to him, I dreamed each night about names. Later, annoyed, I held Philip back, telling him to stop thinking about it. The name was already decided. Philip looked serious and asked, "What will it be?" I took a sip of warm water and casually said, "If it's a boy, let's name him Felix, and if it's a girl, let's name her Floria. How's that?" I affirmed, "Floria, such a meaningful name." Philip fell silent for a moment, then abruptly pulled me into his embrace. His warm voice whispered in my ear, tickling me. He suggested, let's have a third child, one named Felix, one named Floria, and for the last one, we'll call them Gatsby. What do you think? I nestled in his embrace, laughing, my hands around his waist. His low laughter was by my ear. He tightened his hold on my hands, looking serious, and said, "If it's a girl, name her Joy." The moonlight shone brightly. His voice was softer than the moonlight. Have a daughter like the little girl named Joy from the orphanage in those years, who loved wearing white dresses and had bright, crescent-shaped eyes when she smiled. How does that sound? Okay, if it's a boy, let him be like the little boy from the orphanage in those years, handsome and elegant, with a fierce determination like a little wolf cub when he fights. I lifted my head from his chest and caught a glimpse of the moon outside. Many years had passed since Philip's and my childhood, but the moon hanging high in the night sky remained the same as it was back then.